of, yes, got it. Design of interactive systems that help individuals to engage with self-management. I mean, this is an area that has become or has been at the forefront rather of attention in the HCI community for many years now. Many of you are probably familiar with the field of personal informatics that emerged somewhere around actually my PhD dissertation, where a lot of focus went into leveraging the capabilities of new self-monitoring technologies to help individuals learn something new about themselves, increase their self-awareness, and hopefully again translate into this new self-awareness into new behaviors for health and wellness. There were quite a bit of work looking to more directly impact behavior change. Some of you may remember UB Feed Garden. Again, it's a relatively old work that came from Intel and the University of Washington. And this line of work kind of continued over the years. There was some other slightly different trends of this work leveraging social connections, but again, around personal data in health and wellness. More recently, though, there's been an increasing recognition of some of the challenges with these sort of research traditions. One of the probably more prominent one is that these technologies tend to put a lot of burden for data analysis and reflection on individuals themselves and require them to kind of sift through data or to examine somewhat complex visualizations of this data that may be hard even for highly educated individuals, and it may present very hard to overcome challenges for individuals with low education from low-income communities who have little experience with technology and with data analysis. In addition to this, these technologies that focus more on self-reflection tend to have less support for direct action. They may help somebody realize trends in their past, but there's still a bit of a gap between knowing what happened in the past and knowing how to change behaviors in the future. So that's where some of my work again went into identifying new opportunities to more directly provide more actionable and more direct support for action. And the way sort of I've approached this and my lab approached this is by looking at taking opportunities with provided by the new computational modeling of physiology and new advances of machine learning in AI. So again, I'm an HCI person by training, but I do work with many people who do machine learning and AI, and who also do computational modeling, physiological modeling. So this is typically comes from physics and physiology, and it enables inferences, predictions, and sometimes recommendations to be generated computationally. So then for me, for my lab, for my students, the question became, how can we leverage all these increasing computational capabilities, not just the data itself, but also the opportunities for computational analysis and modeling of this data to design intelligent interactive systems for personal health. And when I say intelligent, I really mean systems that can use personal data to model individuals' physiology, behaviors, preferences, and then support their daily decisions that may cumulatively impact health, at the same time promoting their agency, increasing self-awareness and empowerment. And I'll talk later about some of the tensions between more direct support for action and awareness and empowerment. So today I'll talk about 3 examples of these projects. One is called GLUCORACLE, and it uses personalized predictions. The next one is called GLUCOGOALIE, and that's where we go from predictions to recommendations. And the last one is the current work in the lab, where we try to transition from recommendations into something we call microcoaching. So let's start with the first one. The idea in GLUCOGOALIE was to help individuals to make more informed decisions about their meals by predicting the impact of these meals on blood glucose levels. So a lot of my work, as you will see, is in type 2 diabetes. For those of you who are not very familiar with this, it's a condition, it's a chronic condition where individual's body is unable to process glucose in food, in meals, and convert it into energy for a variety of reasons. It could be impairment in secretion of a hormone that helps to process glucose. It could be many other physiological reasons. So it's a spectrum disease. And because it's a spectrum condition, which means that different people experience it differently, there's a great individual variability in how individuals in general, actually, but particularly individuals with diabetes respond to meals. You can give the same meal to two different individuals with diabetes, and their blood glucose will change completely differently. So a lot of self-management, and particularly in nutrition and diabetes, is trying to figure out, well, how do different meals impact me, given my physiology and my specific disruptions to blood glucose regulation. And it could be a very hard process. There's a lot of learning involved. There's a lot of experimentation. Oftentimes, it leads to a lot of frustration and a lot of stress around food, where people just are not sure, looking at the meal, what is this meal going to do to my blood glucose levels? So this is where we hope to make these decisions easier to make and more informed. Again, this is less of a behavior change and more of informed and more decision support, providing individuals with information that can help them to make more informed decisions. So this is where we used a physiological computational model of physiology to model blood glucose regulation for each individual based on their self-monitoring data, and then use these models to generate predictions for how their blood glucose will change if they eat meals. I'm not going to go into the details of the model very much, but basically there exist many models of blood glucose regulation. Generally speaking, they look like a set of differential equations that describe functioning of different organs and processes. For example, what does the liver do? What does the pancreas do? How they influence each other? And the parameters of those models can be tuned, personalized to each individual using a process called data assimilation. So this is a statistical process that is often used in weather forecasting, in drone navigation. There are many different techniques for data assimilation, but in combination, they become sort of this hybrid model, a mechanistic model and a machine learning model that sits on top of it to personalize parameters of the model to each individual. And then we use that to generate predictions for each individual using their own data. So this is very different from machine learning, where you need volumes of data across many individuals. This approach allows us to take one individual's own data and arrive at relatively accurate predictions just for them. So the need for data is dramatically decreased in these kinds of models. We validated the model with a small number of cases where we compared predictions from the model to predictions generated by human experts, experienced dietitians, and also individuals with diabetes. And we found that the model, at the very least, performs as well and often better than human experts. So it's something reasonable that can be used for decision support. And this is the tool that we build on top of the model, where the idea is, if an individual wants to take a picture of the meal, because we want to provide predictions instantaneously, we ask the individual themselves to guesstimate nutrition in the meal, the inclusion of carbohydrate, fat, protein, and fiber. Then we later on, we actually do have a different way of assigning this in a more accurate way. And that's what we use to train the model. But when individual enters those values, the app gives them an instantaneous prediction of how their blood glucose is likely to change if they eat this. Again, with the idea being they take a picture of 2 cookies, they guesstimate carbohydrates, they look at the prediction and they go, oh, gee, this is a bit high. I'm not sure I like that. And they can then take a picture of 1 cookie, look at the prediction and the new prediction, compare it with the old one and say, this seems like a better idea. So maybe I'll just stick with 1 cookie. Again, this is a very simplistic case, and I'll talk in a second about why it doesn't work like this all the time. But we did an evaluation study of GLUCORACLE with 10 individuals with type 2 diabetes. We recruited 5 of them from members of an online diabetes community who were very experienced with diabetes self-management and very knowledgeable about technology. And 5 of them from members of our local community. My university is located, as you would say, a transitional neighborhood. There is a very large first-generation immigrant Latino community, typically with high unemployment rate, low education rates, very little experience using technology in general and technology for health management in particular. So we call them reluctant adopters. We asked them to use it for 4 weeks, and then we conducted qualitative interviews after they were done. Generally, what we found is that in both of those populations, our participants were able to interpret the predictions. They were familiar with the idea of changes in blood glucose levels, and they could understand how to interpret the predictions and how to connect them with their nutritional choices. And what we found is that they found many different ways to use the forecast. Some immediately adjusted the meal that they were planning to eat, as I showed you with cookies. But that was not always possible. So instead, many individuals tried different tricks. So some adjusted similar meals in the future. I'm going to eat this meal now, but when I eat a similar meal next time, I'm going to do something different with it. Or found other ways to compensate for meals with high glycemic impact after eating them. For example, exercising more during that day, drinking more water, going for a walk, and things like that. What we also found, however, that there were quite a few design challenges, and making predictions useful and actionable is less straightforward than it may seem. For example, there was a big question about when to show the predictions. For quite a few of our participants, showing it when the meal was already in front of them was way too late. Basically, the response was, it's there. I'm going to eat it no matter what you show me, because what am I supposed to do with this meal now? So some asked whether it was possible to show forecasts when they were still planning their meals. But in this case, we ran into too much uncertainty. When somebody tells us, I'm going to eat chicken with rice, that's not enough to generate the prediction. How much rice? How much chicken? What kind of chicken? So this is where we're running in a trade-off between the accuracy of predictions, where we need the meal to be relatively completed, and the usefulness of predictions, when the earlier we can show them, the more useful they may be. There were also some questions about the horizon of the impact. There's a difference between, hey, it's just one meal versus, no, it's cumulatively, these meals may lead to a substantial change in hemoglobin A1C, which is more cumulative representation of blood glucose. And one of the biggest challenges we found was the need for recommendations. It's relatively easy to say what to do when you have 2 cookies and a high forecast. If you have a complex meal, soup, or meal with multiple ingredients, or a salad even, what do you do with this meal if you don't like the forecast? So short of just eat half of it, it may be challenging to decide, well, how do I change this meal to still be a reasonable meal, but also to improve the forecast? So this need for recommendations is what inspired our next project, GLUCOGOALIE. And this is where, again, we try to transition from showing predictions to using now a very different computational engine to generate recommendations. Here we focused specifically on recommendations for nutritional goals. So there are many different ways recommendations can be shown. There could be, for example, something closer to what recommender systems do, when it could be a recommendation for a specific meal. There are some challenges with this approach. This is actually what we're working on right now. In this project, we decided to not try to do very specific recommendations, but rather recommend a little more abstractly nutritional goals. And I'll talk about what they look like and how we do them. So this is the, we call this tool GLUCOGOALIE, and this is the GLUCOGOALIE pipeline. Again, it begins with individuals collecting their self-monitoring data. And here in all of these projects, really what we look at is nutritional logs. We try to make the logging as easy as possible for individuals. Just take a picture of the meal and provide its brief description and text. And then we do the processing of this information to arrive at nutritional composition of the meal. Generally, the breakdown again into macronutrients, carbohydrate, fat, protein, and fiber. We also have them track their blood glucose levels before and after they eat the meals. And later on, we added Fitbit to this, but for now, I'll not talk about that. So all this data goes into a computational engine. And here we're using a method developed by Esteban Tabac at the New York University Courant Institute called attributable component analysis. And what it does, it basically breaks down changes in blood glucose and attributes them to different behaviors, to macronutrients in meals, and later on again to levels of physical activity. So what it gives us is macronutrient levels that are consistently associated with high impact on blood glucose levels. So we take that and we run it through an expert system to set some guardrails, because machine learning learns what it does. And our first version of this, we ended up recommending somebody to eat 9 pieces of bacon for breakfast. And we decided that that's not a very good idea, even though it actually, there was a reason why it did that. But it, again, it learns from the data, but it doesn't have the knowledge of nutrition and more generally. So we put things like do not exceed caloric intake of more than 2,000 calories per day. And again, some more nutritional knowledge and guidelines. And then we used an engine to generate natural language sentences that would suggest nutritional goals based on the inferences of the machine learning engine. And we spent almost 2 months figuring out how to formulate those sentences. They're templated sentences where the sentence is generic for everybody, but the words in the sentence are prescribed or selected using rules based on the inferences of machine learning. So it's a combination of machine learning and an expert system that work together. And the goals look something like decrease your carbs to 2 carb choices or 30 grams. Increase your protein to 2 protein choices. Again, it's specific recommendations for how to change macronutrient composition of meals to minimize big changes to blood glucose after meals. And this is what the tool looks like. Again, it's a smartphone app where individuals track their meals, their blood glucose levels. Because it takes the system about a week to generate personalized recommendations, at the beginning, everybody receives goals. They can select goals that are generic. Basically, there's just good eating habits for everybody, really, not just individuals with 2 diabetes, like drink more water, eat more fruits and vegetables, choose lean proteins. And but once they collect enough data to train the model, they start receiving personalized recommendations. They can review them and select whichever goals that are sort of aligned with their personal preferences. And then every time they capture a new meal, they'll see a message. The app will ask them, does this mean, is this meal consistent with your goal? And they can say yes or not really. And then they can track their progress toward meeting their goals. They can see how many meals met their goal and how many meals did not. So that was the GLUCORACLE. Again, we evaluated in two different ways. We ran a controlled experiment focusing on comprehension of goals in particular. And I'm not going to talk about this very much, but actually I don't have a reference here, but I'll add a reference to slides. It was a paper presented at CHI last year. And we ran the deployment study with 20 individuals. This time, all of them recruited from our economically disadvantaged community. We asked them to use it for 4 weeks, and we focused on a few different things. First of all, we wanted to see their engagement. Are they actually using the app? How often they're logging meals? How many goals they're setting? We also wanted to look at goal attainment over time. What happens? Are they achieving more goals as they're using their app? Or not? Does it have any impact on their goal attainment? So in regards to engagement, we found moderate levels of engagement. So again, these are not quantified selfers. These are people who practically, this was the first time they've ever tried logging their meals. We found that all of them, actually, interestingly enough, all 20 engaged somewhat. So we didn't have any non-users in the study. They recorded between 3 and 12 meals per week, with some of them recording maybe 1 or 2 meals per day here and there. So not a very high level of engagement. And others recording practically every meal they ate for the duration of the study. We found that it took about 8 meals for the machine learning engine to start generating recommendations for personalized goals. For most people, it took about 3 to 5 days to record 8 meals. For some, it took longer. And some people in the study never received personalized goals because they just didn't record enough meals with blood glucose level both before and after meal. One of the things I'll talk later is that in these populations, any data-driven technologies are still a bit of a challenge because self-monitoring is still not a common practice for these communities. And what we also saw is that the app generated many different types of goals. What we wanted to see, there is a lot of work that went into this model to try to make it personalized. What we wanted to make sure is that we're not just recommending that everybody decreases the amount of carbohydrates in their meals, because that's a pretty obvious thing to recommend. Basically, you can almost take any person with diabetes and recommend that they decrease carbohydrates. This is a #1 challenge because carbohydrates are the most directly impact blood glucose levels. So what we found is that that was not the case, and it actually did pick up more personalized trends in individuals' records. So this was an encouraging finding. And these are results of the goal attainment. So let me talk a little bit about what this figure represents. Basically here, the horizontal axis, you will see it's a timeline, but it's not it's a chronological order of meals as they were collected without really taking into consideration the distance between meals and time. Basically, they're just stacked one after another. And on the vertical is a success, self-rated average success in meeting the goals. And the 2 lines here, the blue line, or the red line rather, that's a little bit higher, is the self-assessment of individuals. But we also took all their meals, their goals, and showed them to expert dietitians to get an expert assessment. Are these meals really meeting individuals' goals or not? And the blue line is the expert assessment. So a couple of things you can see in this picture. First is the difference between the blue line and the red line, which means that people themselves are quite a bit more positive about their goal attainment than experts are. And experts are quite a bit more critical. But what you also see is an upward trend in both of those lines, which means that goal attainment consistently improved throughout the study. So this is the picture for generic goals. And you see a lot of data points here because generic goals were shared across all individuals. So we have a lot of data for these goals. And this is a picture for personalized goals. And there's a lot, this is a lot more sparse because again, personalized goals are per person. So, but again, even here, there is a very similar trend. There's a difference between the two lines, but the upward trend in both. What was interesting though, and this is not something we necessarily expected or planned for, is that the difference between an individual assessment, or the alignment rather, between the individual's assessment and the expert assessment increased over time, which means that the distance between the blue line and the red line became smaller. That means that individuals not only became better at meeting their goals, but they actually became better at assessing, accurately assessing whether they meet the goals or not. So this learning part wasn't necessarily, again, something that we planned for, but we're very glad to see that it happened. As individuals go through this process again and again, they become better at accurately judging whether their meals meet the goals or not. And of course, again, in the HCI tradition, we like quantitative results, but we like qualitative studies a lot more. So we looked and conducted a bunch of interviews with individuals, trying to see what were some of the subjective perceptions. One of the things we wanted to see whether this idea of being reminded of the goal right when you're about to eat your meal had any impact on individuals' choices. And we did find a lot of positive responses to this, when many individuals felt that this presented an opportunity for reflection, for a bit of a pause to think, oh, wait, is this a good meal for me? Is it not a good meal for me? However, we also had quite a few comments about cold meals. As you go through this process of recording a meal and then thinking about, does it meet the goal? Does it not meet the goal? The meal gets colder and colder. So speeding up this process and making it less, I think, cumbersome or taking less time would be an advantage. We also found many challenges, as you can probably imagine, with formulating the goals. So this was the hardest part, I suppose, of this project, in addition to developing the model itself, is to figure out how do you translate, again, the inference into a goal formulation that anybody can understand and act on. There were many challenges with our decision to use choices as a measure of macronutrient. It's basically an approach endorsed by the American Diabetes Association. It has many advantages, but it also not something individuals are familiar with. The whole idea of focusing on macronutrients was also quite challenging because it works well when you know what carbohydrates are. But for somebody who may not know how to distinguish carbohydrates in the meal, it's hard to make those goals actionable. We also found that there is a need to provide better support on translating these goals into concrete action plans. How do you compose a meal that has no more than 3 carb choices? What does that mean? How does it look like? And we try to do it with examples, and we did have some suggestions for individuals, but there needed to be a lot more to make those goals actionable. And where it definitely fell short for individuals is the lack of attention to their personal preferences. So far, a lot of our modeling focused on physiology and individual response to nutrition and meals with, in terms of blood glucose levels, but we haven't really done much modeling of preferences. and common foods that individuals like. And again, this is a lot of it, this is what we're doing right now. So again, these ideas of it's good to have those goals, but how do you translate them into daily meals and daily decisions? And how do you decide if this meal I'm thinking of having for lunch is actually a good idea or not? So this is again the transition into the newest probably work in the department, this explores this idea of micro-coaching. How do you go from a goal that somebody should follow to daily meal choices? And this was a PhD dissertation of my student who just graduated, Elliot Mitchell, and this is a paper that was just presented recently at CHI in New Orleans, where the idea is, again, to we start by assuming that the individual has a nutritional goal, perhaps using a GLUCOGOALIE, perhaps with recommendations from their healthcare team and nutritionists. But what we want to be able to do is to help them figure out how to make small changes to meals that they eat on a daily basis, their regular meals, to make these meals more consistent with their goals. Now, to sort of illustrate this idea, imagine a conversation that may happen between a healthcare provider and individual, or better yet, between an individual and a chatbot that they may be using on their phone. Maybe the chatbot knows that we're approaching a lunchtime. I think for most of you, it's a bit past lunchtime. For me, it's breakfast. But somewhere around the lunchtime, a smartphone or a chatbot might send a message like, hey, Elliot. Elliot was the student who did it, build this, so all the chatbot talks to Elliot. Hey, Elliot, it's about lunchtime. Do you have any ideas? What do you plan to have for lunch? And the person might answer, not sure, maybe a turkey sandwich. And then the chatbot would ask, do you plan to add anything to your sandwich? And the person might add some potato chips. And the chatbot may ask, what else do you plan to have with your sandwich? Maybe some cheddar and a slice of tomato. And chatbot that knows what this individual's nutritional goal is, and perhaps it's to include at least a serving of fruits and vegetables with every meal, might say something like, this meal may not meet your goal to include at least a serving of fruits and vegetables with every meal. Try adding a side salad or a fruit cup to make it a complete meal. So this conversation came from observing individuals with type 2 diabetes having nutritional consultations with dietitians. This happens a lot. Dietitians may look at individuals' meals and talk about, why do you have this? Look at the different components. And then they may ask some probing questions. And then at the end, they may say, this is a great meal, go ahead. That's a good choice. Or they may say, you know what, given your goal, this may not be actually the best meal for you. Here are a few things you can do to make this meal closer to your goal. So that was the inspiration. And again, the idea for the micro-coaching flow here is that to start by eliciting a description of the planned meal, something simple, like a turkey sandwich, or a burger, or a mixed salad. And then computationally, try to parse out the description of this meal and determine whether this meal meets the goal or not. And there are different ways to do it. It could be done with some combination of natural language processing and maybe rule-based. Or it could be just a classifier that you can build with machine learning, either looking at text or images. So there are many different ways to do that. However, the challenge here could be that the initial description of the meal may be very vague. Turkey sandwich, what does that mean? What kind of sandwich? How much turkey? What kind of bread? What else is in the sandwich? Is to ask follow-up questions, to find a way to generate reasonable short set of follow-up questions to extract additional information to actually make a more accurate determination whether the meal is likely to meet the goal or not. And then using that, provide feedback on goal attainment. And then if the meal doesn't meet the goal, make recommendation for how to change the meal. So this is a general view of micro-coaching. Now, so far, we've only focused on identifying appropriate follow-up questions. So this is what the Kai paper was about. We started by observing, again, experts. How do they do it? If we look at diabetes educators and registered dietitians, we observed how they ask follow-up questions. And we did a study where we gave them a bunch of meals and with goals, and we asked them, does this meal meet the goal or not? And if there is not enough information, what question would you ask to figure that out? So what we found is, first of all, that the follow-up questions were very goal specific. Depending on what the goal is, the questions would vary dramatically. And sometimes the questions were more dependent on the goal rather than on the meal that the individual was actually planning on eating. And then second, even though they generated a large number of questions, 60 questions altogether, when you look at it really and you start reading through those questions, they really only 4 types of questions that they were asking. And again, we started looking at it from the machine learning point of view. They really kind of, particularly from the reinforcement learning, which is what we wanted to use in this project, they really fell into 2 different categories, the search and the drill down. So the search is, what else do you plan to have with this meal? Because the person may tell you the main item in the meal, but not what other things were included. And the second type is the drill down. What type of whatever that is you're going to have? How much of it were you going to have? How was it prepared? How is it going to be cooked? Because all of those questions have substantial impact on assessment of goal attainment. So then we took these ideas and we developed 4 different types of dialogue management engines that would generate these kinds of questions. The first one was the most simple one, scripted. Let's just ask 4 same questions for every meal and every goal. Simple. Does this work? Would that work? Now, we did work with experts again to figure out a really good set of 4 questions, but with the idea that they're generic enough that it doesn't even matter what the goal is or what the meal is, they can be asked for anybody. The second one is rule-based. Let's take a very simple, again, natural language processing and parse out the description of the meal and figure out what's in the meal, but then use a simple set of rules to select appropriate question. So for example, if the goal is to eat more protein, lean protein, can we take a description of the meal and figure out whether this description contains a word that indicates protein? And then if it does, then we can ask what kind of protein it is. What kind of chicken? Is it chicken with skin, which would make it not lean, or chicken breast, which would make it lean? The third one was more machine learning oriented. And here again, we wanted to use reinforcement learning to learn appropriate order of questions. Again, preset types of questions. So here we are learning the order of the questions using a corpora of dialogues created with Amazon Mechanical Turk. And then the last one is our basically control condition random. We, of the all available questions that anybody can ask, we just pick a question randomly. So here are the examples of those 4 different types of dialogues. The first one is random, and it's for the same goal, same nutritional goal, eat no more than 2 portions of carbs with every meal, and same initial description of the meal, which is here, Rice Krispie cereal with milk. And this is how, I don't know if you can see well the slide here, whether the text is big enough. But again, this is how, like, the random would really just pick a random question. The scripted would always start with, based for this goal, it would always start with, what else will you have with your meal? Then it will go into what portion of carbohydrates like rice, pasta, or bread would you have with your meal? And the next, it would be, what amount of fruits will you eat? Because fruit is also a carbohydrate. So again, same questions, no matter what the meal is. The next one, if you can see the first question, already figured out that rice is a carbohydrate. So the next question is about rice, and that's based on the description of the meal. And the last one really is the machine learning, where it picks up the questions based on the how we set up offline. I'm not going to go too much about the reinforcement learning here, but ask me questions if you're interested. So this was not an online learning, it was offline. We set up a bunch of experiments with Turkers on Amazon Mechanical Turk, where we gave them meal, we asked them to ask appropriate questions, and then we sort of learned the order of questions that they were asking. But that's how those questions would look like. And then our study so far, we didn't try it in like a real world environment. We conducted the study with Amazon Mechanical Turk, where we run Turkers through 240 dialogues generated using 4 different types of dialogue engines. And we used 3 different nutritional goals only. Choose lean proteins, eat no more than 2 portions of carbs in every meal, and make half of your meal fruits and non-starchy vegetables. And we picked those 3 goals because they're very different. The first one is purely qualitative. It's about the quality of the food. It has nothing to do with amounts. The second one is just the amount of specific food type. So only carbohydrates that we're interested in. The last one is the most difficult one because it's proportion. So here, it's not enough to know, first of all, it's fruits and starchy vegetables, which is a more complex thing to figure out than just carbohydrates. And then second, we need to know what else is in the meal so that we can compare how much of it is fruits and vegetables. And we compared the 4 different types of dialogue management engines, and our main criteria were the length of dialogues. Now, if we can ask unlimited number of questions of every person, we probably could figure out all the information we need, and we'll probably use the users after the first couple of interactions, because nobody wants to spend hours talking to their chatbot describing their meals. So it needed to be a very short interactions, and we wanted to keep the number of follow-up questions very short. And perceived dialogue quality, and we use criteria such as how the naturalness of the strategy, the naturalness of the conversation, and the coherence of the dialogue. And then the composite score was a combination of the 3. And then the important criteria for us was also success in obtaining information needed to assess the goal attainment. Because if the conversation felt natural and it was short, but we still don't know if the person met the goal or not, that's not very useful conversation. So very briefly, these are the results for the dialogue length. And what you see here is that reinforcement learning actually ended up with the shortest length of conversations needed to figure out whether the meal meet the goal or not. Now, here, the funny thing you see here is that the scripted dialogues don't have any error bars on them. It's because there's no variability. The length of those dialogues is always the same because it's exactly the same 3 follow-up. Actually, I can't remember whether it's 3 or 4, but it's exactly the same number of questions for every person. Rule-based reinforcement learning and random vary their conversational length. And those are shown here. While reinforcement learning was the shortest dialogues, the perceived quality was actually mixed. And what you see here, and I'm circling, or rather marking, the type of dialogue management that received the highest composite score. So they were perceived the best across the different criteria. And what you see, funny enough, is that the scripted dialogues were perceived as the best, highest quality. which is kind of a mixed bag here, because yes, on one hand, scripted, we worked really hard. We probably overdid it a bit. We worked really hard to make those scripted dialogues to seem natural and the flow of those questions to seem reasonable. Where it gets challenging is that those scripted dialogues only get us to our goal 65% of the time. Because again, it's the same set of questions and we have to stop after the last question. 35% of the time, we don't know, we still don't have enough information to gauge whether the person met the goal or not. The other two data-driven engines, the rule-based and the reinforcement learning-based, always get to the goal. They always end up with 100% of information needed to determine whether the meal met the goal or not. But here they were judged as less natural and less coherent in some cases. Although if you look at the coherence, they're actually pretty close to, some of them are pretty close to scripted. All right, so let's talk about how to wrap it all up, a little bit of a general conclusions on all of this across these three different projects. So first, what we find is that we still have a lot of questions about what appropriate interaction paradigms can we use to provide decision support in different circumstances. I think I've tried to show you that predictions work in some cases, but they're a lot more challenging and less intuitive, as you would imagine, or making them useful is a lot more challenging than would appear. It's hard to figure out when to show the predictions, what exactly to predict to make it both accurate and useful. With recommendations, again, what we're finding is that it's hard to figure out the right way to deliver those recommendations. And with reinforcement learning in particular, what we find, and this is a finding that we see actually in several CHI papers this year, is that the flow of the dialogue is not always the most intuitive. Reinforcement learning gets the job done, but sometimes because it changes or alternates between exploration and exploitation, it may seem random to a person who's trying to understand, why are you asking me this question? How is it connected to the previous question? So there's still a lot of design challenges there. What we're also finding is that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about what do we actually want ultimately from this kind of engagement? Do we want to build reliance on these technologies and trust with these technologies? Or do we want to focus on learning, as you saw with GLUCOGOALIE, where actually nutritional learning was an unexpected outcome of this study, so that people become better at making these decisions on their own and don't need to rely on these technologies quite so much in the future. What we also, and I'm sort of going fast looking at the time, what we're also finding is that there are some interesting challenges we're running into with our HCI design methods. For example, participatory design is becoming harder and harder the more we venture into unfamiliar territories with technologies that are difficult to understand. When we try to ask people, how would you like to receive, imagine that you are working with an intelligent system that can provide you with any recommendations. It's really hard to imagine for somebody what this system can do. Sometimes it's even hard for us to imagine what the capabilities of the inference engines we're working on. We've tried to use Wizard of Oz studies, and sometimes that's actually a really great idea, particularly with conversational systems, with chatbots. But here we're finding that it's relatively hard. It's easy to simulate the interaction, but we still need to build the machine learning engine first to develop the interaction around it. And I suppose lastly here, this is where it also gets interesting, what kind of expertise is needed for this kind of work. As you could see, some of the computational systems or engines that are used in the studies are relatively sophisticated. So I have to work with physicists, and developing common language to figure out how do we talk about these models, how we build these models is non-trivial. And I think a more common approach is to take the model that was developed before and then build an interactive system around it. But we find that co-design of the model itself between experts in HCI and computational modeling actually is a more advantageous strategy, but it's harder to accomplish. So I think this is it. Just to acknowledge a large group of collaborators and fortunate to have lots of funding and ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Lena. That was a great talk, lots of really interesting insights. We have time for a couple of quick questions. Anybody want to ask anything? If not, I can start with one. So for, I think it was for GLUCOGOALIE, you showed the results of the experts versus the people's own success to progress, success towards their goals, and the people were much more positive than the experts were. Okay, they got closer together toward the end, but why was it that? Why were people so much more, overconfident in their own assessment?
So this is there are several different. This is a great question. There are several different reasons for this. We looked a little bit more into the literature on this, and actually is a apparently well-known fact in nutritional literature that generally all of us, we overestimate healthy foods and our healthy habits and underestimate our unhealthy habits. There's a lot of literature to show that people overestimate inclusion of fruits and vegetables in their diet and underestimate calories in their meals. So this is something that just happens naturally. But I think a lot of times it's also, there was a long time ago work by Gina Frost that looked at how people sort of focus on healthy aspects of their diets and sometimes ignore the unhealthy ones. So the person may have focused on lean turkey in their sandwich, but may have completely skipped the fact that they had a lot of mayo and bacon in that sandwich. And that's what the expert noticed. And that's why there was a disconnect there.
Yeah, right. So it's nothing to do with your group. It's all of us who do the same thing, really.
Yeah, and that's something that we didn't know, but we confirmed that with the literature later on.
Maybe time for one. Oh, Sharon, go for it.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. I think in the first project, I think it's a very smart idea to recruit two types of users. One is kind of more educated, and another group is kind of more is disadvantaged. But I don't remember, did you say any differences between in findings between these two different groups?
Yes, I didn't go into that in the talk, but a lot of it is in the paper. It was not what we expected. It actually was in the opposite direction from our expectations. We found that the more experienced group, the members of the online community, were harder to impress. Their expectations were much higher in terms of how smooth the application is, how sophisticated the features are. And also they knew so much about their self-management that a lot of times the predictions were very predictable for them. They were very rarely surprised, or they rarely learned something that they didn't already know. So for them, they felt that, many of them said, oh, I wish I had something like this 10 years ago when I was just diagnosed and I was just learning. Our group that was economically disadvantaged, however, had a lot more positive experience, because for many of them, this was the first time they actually saw something like this. So it was very eye-opening. And they were willing to overcome some of the clunkiness of the prototype and sort of close their eyes on that, because they felt that they were learning so much from it.
Wow, that's really, yeah, kind of different from what we expect.
Yes, exactly. We totally expected it to be the other way around.
Right, right. And do we have time for another question?
As long as it's a quick one.
Yeah, I think the recommendations are mainly about meals too. And I wonder for diabetes, probably there's other options like probably you can eat that, but if you exercise more, it's still okay. Yeah. So wonder whether you have considered like broader options.
Yes, absolutely. So this was the first work that we did. But right now, we kind of transitioned from a small, we're running a currently clinical trial that is based on this work, but it looks at both physical activity and nutrition together. And we have participants use Fitbit to track their physical activity. So yes, it looks at both. It's still not everything because there's sleep, there's stress, there are a lot of other things that we don't have way of tracking very confidently. But at the very least, we look at meals and physical activity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much, Lena. So don't forget, everyone, Lena is coming to visit us face-to-face, old school style, in the second and third weeks of August. So if you want to arrange a time to chat, or you've got some interesting ideas for collaborations, send Lena an email message. I'll circulate her email address around on the mailing list. Send her an email. And then you can organise to do something when she's going to be here in Glasgow in the second and third week of August. Okay, so we should finish. Just like to say many thanks again for giving a great talk, and look forward to seeing you in just a few weeks' time.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Lena. Bye-bye.
Bye.